The mysterious case of space. We have the same questions again. Who owns it? Who can operate there? And what are they allowed to do? But these are not ancient questions. We have been on the seas for thousands of years, but we have not been in space for thousands of years. So these are new questions and new concerns. What can you think of that space can be used for by a state? Once again, go ahead and think about it. What can we use space for? Well, commerce and transport, communication, remote sensing, probably in the future resources, military activities, recreation, that's right, and dumping. I know, dumping. Is that nuts or what? Well, let me tell you something. There was a time in the United States, not too long ago, when we were talking about taking nuclear waste and jetting it off into space. What's the obvious problem with that? Well, what happens if the spacecraft blows up? Right, we've just created a dirty bomb, so it didn't happen. It doesn't mean it won't happen in the future, though. Space, the final frontier, right? Star Trek. It's true. Space really is the final frontier. And there's a lot of it to be a frontier. Until relatively recently, the territory of a state was considered the following things. It's land and sea territory on the surface of the planet, extending down into the Earth to the very center of the Earth. So if this is the Earth, and that red line represents a very extensive land and sea area of a country, and then the yellow dot in the middle is the very center of the planet, that red triangle extends down from the surface area of the state down into the center of the planet, and that would have been seen as its territory. And the air above the state. So this area right here, which is supposed to be the atmosphere, that would also be the state's sovereign territory. But how far up that went was really theoretical, because we've spent almost all of human history, of course, on the surface of the planet. It's only been relatively recently that we have actually been able to sustain ourselves up in the air. And then in 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik into space. In 1958, the United States followed with Explorer 1, and the space race was on. And then in 1969, this happened. That's right. Neil Armstrong became the first person to stand on the face of the moon. And of course, we, the United States, planted our flag there. You tell me, why does a country plant its flag in a place it has never been before? It's to do what? Go ahead, you can tell me. You can say it, don't be afraid. It's to claim it, of course. It's not just to say we were there. It's to claim that thing. Well, unlike Antarctica, activities in space can be seen as a threat. Most spacecraft have to do with things like communications or weather or GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems, or GPS, which is Global Positioning Systems, like what you use on your phone, navigation, and so on. But satellites and spacecraft have the ability to have direct flyover and surveillance of foreign countries without their permission. And that includes adversaries. All of these things have obvious military uses and purposes to them. Some states might perceive access to information through broadcasting using satellites as threatening to their culture. There's one basic view that emphasizes kind of free and unrestricted flow of information, But there is another type of view that does not like free and unrestricted flow of information. And you can imagine that there are some countries that don't want, for example, Western views on pornography or excessive violence or any kind of controversial material, even commercials for that matter. And if there's competing religious views or economic views or political views or ideas about education or ideas about relationships or women or whatever it may be, there may be places that do not want other people's views and do everything they can to restrict those types of views. But of course, when you have space and you have satellites, you can operate in ways that in the past we could not normally operate. As more and more countries get involved in space, so in other words, shooting things up into space, whether that's to orbit the Earth like a satellite or beyond, this of course increases competition. And that brings up issues of sovereignty and jurisdiction and ownership. And these things are arising all the time. Well, the United Nations has had multiple conferences on space usage and norms in space, kind of like the laws of the sea in a way, but in this other thing that basically is vast and unending. Currently, there are 5 treaties that attempt to set the rules for space. And these are overseen by the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, that kind of unyielding, uncomfortable acronym that you see right there. So the 2019, the Outer Space Treaty is about this. So I'm just going to read this to you. The treaty is a foundation of international space law for signatory nations, and there's 108 countries that signed it. The treaty presents principles for space exploration operations. Some of these are going to be redundant, as you're going to see in a moment. Space activities are for the benefit of all nations, and any country is free to explore, orbit, and beyond. There is no claim of sovereignty in space. No nation can own space, the moon, or any other body. So not Mars, not Jupiter, not Venus, not the sun. We're not allowed to own any of those things according to this treaty. Weapons of mass destruction are forbidden in orbit and beyond, and the moon, the planets, and other celestial bodies can only be used for peaceful purposes. Any astronaut from any nation is an envoy of all of mankind, and signatory states must provide all possible help to astronauts when needed, including emergency landing in foreign countries or at sea. Signatory states are each responsible for their space activities, including private commercial endeavors, and must provide authorization and continuing supervision. And nations are responsible for damage caused by their space objects and must avoid contaminating space and other celestial bodies. You know, sometimes these things fall out of space. And there's something called the Rescue Agreement, which, as I said, is a little bit redundant. It says basically this: the signatories agree to take all possible actions to help or rescue astronauts in need. Okay, so if something goes wrong, we're all supposed to help if we can do it. The Moon Agreement, this is a very interesting one. The agreement states that celestial bodies can only be used for peaceful purposes, that they should not be contaminated, that the UN should always be made aware of any station on a non-Earth body, and that if resource mining on the moon becomes feasible, an international regime must be established to govern how these resources are obtained and used. Guess what? The United States is not a signatory to the Moon Agreement. How about that? The Liability Convention basically says this: signatories take full responsibility for any damage caused by their space objects and agree to standard procedures for adjudicating damage claims. So if something falls out of the sky and hits you, and it was a Russian satellite, you sue the Russians, basically. And the Registration Convention, which is this: expanding a space object register, the convention empowers the UN Secretary General to maintain a register of all space objects, so that, in other words, we will know what's up there. If you want to read more, you can check out that website right there. What about these guys? Elon Musk and SpaceX, Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin, and Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic. What about those guys? Yes, we know they're super rich, and we know they're going into space. So these are now non-state entities entering space. Until relatively recently, all space exploration was being done overwhelmingly, well, in totality, by governments. And now you have these non-state entities. All three of those guys have their operations in the United States, and two of them are immigrants. You know, Elon Musk comes from South Africa, and Richard Branson comes from the United Kingdom. Why don't they live and operate in China or Russia or Iran? Or for that matter, in South Africa or the UK? Why do you think that is? Why are they operating in the United States? And who does that benefit? And why are they involved in the first place? Well, obviously, they want to make a name for themselves into the future, long after they themselves are gone. They want to make a name for themselves and be kind of on the cutting edge, the vanguard of space exploration. And of course, for commercial activity, and as we've seen already, for recreational activity, going into space for a vacation, and maybe for some other things too. And remember, they're all billionaires, so a profit motive is probably engaged someplace. This is probably not just out of the goodness of their hearts. Maybe, but only over time will we know this. Space, the final frontier.